Bet the Board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Fuhrman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast. Division preview season continues in earnest. One final division in the South before we head west, but it is the NFC South, the topic of debate today. I'm your host, Todd Fuhrman, joined as always by my esteemed colleague and co-host, the one, the only Payne Insider. And Payne, we reached the midway point with the AFC South last week, and we'll be 75% of the way done with the preseason NFL previews by the time we reach completion of this after 3.5 hours this morning.
More good math out of you. I like it.
I mean, I got a couple of fingers. I can count up to 8. I can knock them down one at a time. It's about the extent of what I'm capable of doing this time of year as we try and hit the ground running before we get into midseason form.
Did you survive the heavy winds?
You know what? The tropical storm that impacted the West Coast graced us, albeit briefly, out here in Las Vegas. Got a little rain, got a 45 to 50 mile an hour wind gust. So a little bit unusual. Didn't need to put hurricane shutters on the house like you do down there in South Florida, but a little bit unusual when the temperature drops to the high 60s, low 70s this time of year. But thankfully, no damage in the immediate vicinity.
Well, that's a positive, and typically now you just get hurricane-proof windows. The shutter thing is
done.
Pretty much done for the most part.
What kind? I mean, you just put the hurricane windows on once, leave them and forget it, or what's the process?
Yeah. It's you get them installed. They're heavy-duty windows. That's it.
Look, technology. It's a wonderful thing when it works out in your favor and saves you from trying to put forth some of the.
This first time guy's seen wind in his entire life.
Look, I mean, you move out to the West Coast, you don't expect to deal with inclement weather. Okay, I dealt with enough of that bullshit growing up in the Midwest. Don't like to shovel snow anymore. Don't like temperatures that dip below 30 as is. I mean, we have a nice trip planned in December. I'm a little bit apprehensive about the snow, cold, and rain that you and I may encounter, but we'll divulge those details much deeper into the college football season as a result. This division, Payne, very interesting from top to bottom. And while we talked a little bit last week about the AFC South having a potential separation of the haves and have-nots, where Jacksonville at least knew the trajectory of their organization, this division feels like there are 4 teams that are trying to figure a lot of things out. And as a result, you have a very muddled picture in terms of win totals and odds to win the division, but you've also seen some prices start to move throughout the course of the offseason, and that'll be one of the repeating trends that we'll discuss as we get into this quartet of teams. And we can start, as we always do, with good old alphabetical order, with the Atlanta Falcons at the forefront. And when you look at Atlanta, we've seen their odds to win the division come down this offseason from a shade less than 3-1 earlier to a price just north of 2-1 right now. Their win total sits at 8.5, heavily shaded to the over. That's been on the move as well. More on that in a bit. And when you look at their odds to win the NFC and the Lombardi Trophy, a shade less than 25-1, pretty much prevailing through the market. And to win the Super Bowl, you're looking at them upwards of 55-60-1. This was a team last year that limped to the finish, going 7-10. They pulled the plug on the Marcus Mariota experiment, electing to at least see what they had, or as far as glimpses were concerned, of the quarterback they drafted in Desmond Ridder. They swallowed a ton of dead cap space as they parted ways with high-priced veterans like Matt Ryan and Julio Jones. They did go on a bit of a spending spree, relatively speaking, this offseason to kind of fortify their defense. They were in a ton of close games last year, and you always wonder what that means going forward. As you've told us, lose big, lose small, win big, and I'm not going to put the Falcons in that latter bucket just yet. But as far as Coach Arthur Smith, the one thing that you have to give him credit for, he knows the identity of his football team. He knows how he wants them to go out there and execute. And by hook or by crook, this is a team that's going to try and run the football, play a little bit of keep away, and take those deep shots when they avail themselves. Payne, Atlanta drew a ton of criticism depending on, some of the draft nicks that you read coming into the entry draft, taking Bijan Robinson inside the top 10. We know he can be an electric talent, but fits their system well. Before we get into some of the skill position guys and how they look on the offensive line, though, I guess the overarching question is, when you look at Desmond Ridder in the quarterback position, what kind of expectations do you have for him coming into the season, given what we saw in a 4-game sample size last year?
No reason to bury the lead. We can end this podcast in about 4 sentences here if we really want to.
That would be efficient. That would be economy of scale, to say the least.
I don't have a ton of reservations, right? I'll just be fully transparent. On May 31st, we started buying positions on the Atlanta Falcons. Over 8 flat, pretty large. South Division futures at nearly 3-1 smaller. And I think it's Desmond Ridder a little bit. I think it's Arthur Smith. I wouldn't be so convinced we're going to see the type of offense we saw last year. I mean, you just kind of look back at how last year unfolded, like what Arthur Smith dealt with, the current roster, the NFC landscape that we've, kind of been beating the drum about, right? And then you get information that's probably not publicly accessible, and so all of those things come back positive, and it triggers a buy. And then you kind of just look at what this roster is this year. It's substantially better. Arthur Smith was basically, playing with a hand tied behind his back last year. I mean, 42% of the Falcons' salary cap last season was dead money. Paying players that weren't actually on the roster contributing. It's just 9% this season. So the players Atlanta's organization's paying can actually contribute and help Arthur Smith on the field. And somehow, if you look last year, the Falcons' PYTHAG number was 7.9, virtually the same price the Falcons market was in late May. It just didn't make sense to us. And then, what you hit on is the quarterback situation. I think Arthur Smith kicked the tires on a quarterback that he was familiar with in Marcus Mariota, kind of a bridge quarterback. And the hope was that he would be serviceable enough to transition them out of salary cap hell, and then you could figure out the situation from there. Marcus Mariota wasn't serviceable. I mean, he was horrific, a total detriment. And then when Mariota lost his job, decided to pout and chose not to act like a veteran and help a rookie quarterback mature. And that, I think, is kind of your baseline comparison, is that Marcus Mariota was quarterback 40 out of 41 qualifiers in adjusted accuracy. Yikes. On throws 15-plus yards in the air, Mariota was inaccurate on over 37% of those throws. On deep passes, 20-plus yards, Mariota was 38 out of 40 qualifiers in adjusted accuracy. And what's kind of the hubbub right now in Philadelphia? We're not sure this is quarterback 2 for us this year. And so
a nice 1 year, $5 million deal to hold the clipboard, and that may not quite pan out by the time we get to week 1.
It was very evident that Arthur Smith didn't trust Mariota to throw it. And, Desmond Ridder wasn't quite ready yet. And so the Falcons offense was 31st in pass rate over expectation. They just didn't, throw the ball. Arthur Smith was clearly trying to slow games down, limit plays, and hope for some positive variance. The Falcons were 28th in neutral situation pace, the very slowest in the league with a lead. But what's actually really impressive to me about Arthur Smith in the Falcons offense last season was that without a single threat of a quarterback beating a defense with his arm, and the Falcons ranking dead last in first down pass rate, so there wasn't much mystery, the Falcons still had the 3rd best schedule adjusted rushing offense. We're 4th in EPA per rush, and the offense overall was fringe top 10 in early down success rate. And again, I think there'll be a little bit more mystery this season. I don't know what Desmond Ridder is, and I don't think a lot of people do. Just being fully transparent, I thought less of Ridder at Cincinnati than perception, but I think, when you're projecting ahead, it's virtually impossible to assign a number worse than Mariota. And so our projection has Atlanta upgrading its quarterback play year over year. I expect Arthur Smith to help Ridder more as well, right? Early down pass rate's going to tick up this season. Pace is going to tick up this season. If Desmond Ridder is somewhere between quarterback 12 and 16, Yahtzee, right? Atlanta's going to surprise some people. If Ritter is between quarterback 17 and 23, it's still an upgrade over Mariota. And then there's the other team positives, right? I mean, Atlanta's projected to face a bottom 10 schedule of defenses, a bottom 7 schedule of pass defenses. You mentioned Bijan Robinson. I get long term, it might not make sense to draft him 8th overall, but when we talk about the 2023 season, it's a positive. I mean, not only Bijan Robinson, but Matthew Bergeron, the lineman they took, I believe, with the 38th pick, they're both going to contribute day one. The offensive line might not have great depth due to, some injuries, but the first 5 is extremely formidable. Jake Matthews is a good pass blocking tackle. Chris Lindstrom, one of the league's best guards. Bergeron's going to start at left guard. Drew Dahlman returned to practice last week. Replacement level in his first full season starting. Should see a year 3 bump. The light came on for Caleb McGarry at right tackle last season, and the Falcons were 4th in adjusted line yards created. And what's so special about being top 5 and creating running space? Those 5 guys up front were constantly blocking 7 and 8 defenders. Cordarrelle Patterson ran into 8+ man boxes on 37% of his carries last season. Tyler Algier, 40% of his carries saw 8+ man boxes, most in the NFL. Those numbers are going to decrease this season with, I think better quarterback play, a little bit more aggression, a little bit more downfield passing, a little bit higher pass rates on early downs. So the run numbers potentially get even better in terms of efficiency. I expect Drake London to continue growing. I mean, to the outside world, had a quiet rookie season, but London was 11th in yards per route run. Started well, finished on fire. 2 drops on 114 targets. So that's nice to have when you're breaking in, a young quarterback. Kyle Pitts is healthy, and he's happy about the quarterback change. We've talked about him in years past and probably hasn't lived up to the 4th overall pick, but he's just such a versatile chess piece, right? You can put Pitts all over, right? Slot, wide, in line, averaged over 2 yards per route run his rookie season. And even though last year it was a down sophomore year and then he had the injury, Pitts still led the league receiving a target on 29% of his routes. That was most in the NFL. Atlanta brought in a veteran in Jonnu Smith, someone that Arthur Smith has worked with in Tennessee, and put him in a position to sign this massive $50 million contract. Now, he was a ghost in New England. They didn't really use him, but we kind of forget that he's 27 and in his prime. You have Carter El-Hodge, has some interesting potential coming off his best season as a pro. We even saw growth last year. I mean, as bad as Marcus Mariota was, the Falcons improved from 28th to above average. And so I think there's a real chance here that the Falcons could have a top 10 offense this season, Todd, if things kind of go the way we project them.
If they have a top 10 offense, they won't need to get nearly as much out of a defense last year that really lacked any ferocity. This is an organization that has struggled immensely to generate pressure on opposing quarterbacks. When you look at the job that Ryan Nielsen's going to be taxed with, he played the cheapest defense in the entire league last year, and there were a ton of holes when you dig into some of the underlying metrics for what the Falcons' stop unit didn't do. But they went out on a bit of a spending spree and brought in some familiar names as far as veterans are concerned. Now, when we talk about the level of production or long-term viability, that remains anybody's best guess. But we've seen what Bud Dupree can contribute when healthy. We know what Calais Campbell can be. And as you try and identify some of the other players that are out there, Caden Ellis, who you bring in from the New Orleans Saints, you try and fortify a defensive backfield, getting Jeff Okudah on a cheap deal, although he's a little bit nicked up, and we'll see exactly when he hits the field. How do we set a baseline for where Atlanta can be on the defensive side, knowing that the offensive scheme that Arthur Smith wants to run makes it as easy a transition as possible for a defense that, quite frankly, won't be on the field nearly as much as some other stop units if the offense is running well?
So you effectively just gave our listeners a glimpse that there's a ton of defensive change for Atlanta, right? The brand new quarterback, coordinator, and then you kind of think about where Ryan Nielsen comes from, right? New Orleans. He's been part of those aggressive Saints defenses under Dennis Allen. I know the Saints did everything over the last few years to keep him. LSU threw big money at him, and that's how highly regarded Nielsen was in the Saints building. And his specialty is the defensive line, and that's where most of Atlanta's horses are. I kind of mentioned at the top, right, like the Falcons being able to spend on players that actually contribute on the field this season. Most of that off-field spend came along the defensive line. The Falcons were dead last in pressure rate last year, 26th in pass rush win rate. So you look at a guy like Grady Jarrett, finally has some help. He finished 10th among interior linemen in pass rush win rate last season, despite seeing one of the league's highest rates of double teams. So in comes David Onyemata and Calais Campbell. Onyemata was unstoppable in 2020 and 2021. Campbell still has some juice left in the tank. That's pretty clear. Then on the edge, you have Arnold Ibikite, second-round pick from 2022. Everyone in the Falcons building is pegging him to have a breakout season. You have the veterans you mentioned, Bud Dupree and Lorenzo Carter. Both are serviceable, but neither's lived up to the hype and the pedigree. Both are in contract years, though, so something you're kind of looking for. Linebacker play should improve with Caden Ellis, who you mentioned. He's following Nielsen over from New Orleans. 19% pressure rate on pass rush snaps from the linebacker position. Ellis was fantastic against the run as well. Highly sought after in free agency when you look at that price tag. Troy Anderson is a second-round pick in 2022. Really only one direction to go for him. It was a poor rookie season. So, I think the Falcons' front seven is positioned to be much better, especially impacting the quarterback and getting some pressure. The Falcons' offense, our defense rather, I think, will have a easier time getting to the quarterback. When you look at that schedule, Falcons are also projected to face the easiest schedule of passing offenses in the NFL, so that's a real positive as well when you're looking to see an uptick, and we know how crucial passing is to a lot of these teams and efficiency metrics. I think when you look at the Falcons secondary, that was 29th in defensive pass efficiency, 30th in passing success rate allowed. A.J. Terrell regressed last season. You're hoping that he can return to the 2021 form when he was... that season kind of came out of nowhere, so I wouldn't project something that good.
That felt more like the outlier than anything else we've seen from him.
Yes. 43% of targets were caught, 47 passer rating allowed when Terrell was targeted in 2021. I do believe that you get a performance somewhere between that year and last year. Jesse Bates was the big signing this offseason. Certainly overpaid, but Bates has proven to be one of the league's better free safeties. Grant Ritchie is heading into year 3, improved from year 1 to year 2, so there's some upside there for Ritchie. D. Alford had a very nice rookie season. He's being propelled into the starting slot role. Then you have 3 solid potential contributors, right? Atlanta makes that low-risk move trading for Jeffrey Okudah. He was the 3rd overall pick in 2020. He's improved each season, was serviceable last year. Maybe, the change of environment and scheme unlocks something once he returns from injury. He'll be out the first few weeks. Mike Hughes also dealing with a soft tissue injury, and then you have the rookie corner, Clark Phillips from Utah. If Phillips came out in the 2022 draft, most anticipated him being, a late 1, early 2, so good value getting Phillips, I think, in round 4 a year later. And then, again, you like the schedule. The list of quarterbacks Atlanta plays is not daunting, right? It's rookie Bryce Young twice. You have a first-time starter in Jordan Love, C.J. Stroud early, Sam Howell, either Baker or Trask, twice. Arizona possibly without Kyler, Justin Fields. You have a rookie in Anthony Richardson. And then even the veteran and proven quarterbacks on Atlanta's schedule, they're not like the elite of the elite, right? It's Goff, Tannehill, Cousins, and Carr. The 2 toughest are Trevor Lawrence and Aaron Rodgers. So we're projecting Atlanta's defense to improve from, one of the league's worst to just below average. That would be a real nice, I think, year 1 for Nielsen as a first-time defensive coordinator.
Look, it's a team where you have a ton of stock arrows, to use the cliche term we talk about in college football and the NFL, pointing in one direction. We'll see if the Falcons can go out there and realize some of that, because there doesn't appear to be a clear front runner in this division. And if the light goes on for Desmond Ridder, or to your point at the top, if he can just be average, knowing how dynamic this ground game was last year when everyone knew in the league knew it was coming, the defense takes a step forward, the Atlanta Falcons can be a force to be reckoned with in the South, especially with the relatively soft landing spot where they'll kick off the season with some of those quarterbacks that aren't exactly exactly what we would call the elite at the position by any stretch of the imagination. When you go from Atlanta Payne to the Carolina Panthers, obviously a regime change there as well. New start for a familiar head coach in Frank Reich. Carolina trades up to the number 1 overall pick to bring in Bryce Young. So instead of looking at instability at the quarterback position, they can build slowly from the ground floor up. The Panthers find their odds to win the NFC South at a shade north of 4-1. Their win total 7.5 flat. To win the NFC, you're looking at a price right around 35-1 and north of 100-1 if you believe in this team getting the chance to engrave their name on the Lombardi Trophy. As far as Carolina is concerned, this is an organization that has struggled mightily since David Tepper took over back in 2018 as the owner. They've compiled a record of 29-53 during that span, 0 winning seasons and 0 playoff appearances. Last year, they were close to potentially winning the division, came up just short against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And when we look at Frank Reich, we can say what we want about his ability to work with offenses. This is going to be a very different dynamic in play here with a young quarterback that he has to mold instead of some of the veteran retreads that he dealt with for an extended period in Indianapolis. Payne, I guess we may as well start at the baseline. You send DJ Moore to Chicago. You trade up for that number 1 overall pick. Clearly, this is an organization that's all in on Bryce Young. But how patient do you have to be when you hand the baton over to the first overall pick in the draft? There were questions about how his game will translate to the NFL as far as arm strength and some of those dynamics. But this is clearly a franchise in transition where big things are expected, mainly because of the division that they play in.
Yeah, none of the quarterbacks that were in this year's draft were perfect. It was a pretty weak draft class for the quarterback position. But I think Carolina was really aggressive getting to the top of the draft. I mean, Carolina hasn't had a young quarterback with potential really since Cam Newton. And then you kind of hit on it, like Frank Reich didn't have one after Andrew Luck retired. So, I mean, the price to get Bryce Young will only really be thought of as exorbitant if Bryce Young doesn't end up being a franchise quarterback. But you can see why Carolina and Reich agreed to aggressively pursue a young quarterback based on both of their recent histories, right? So it makes sense from that perspective. I don't know if this works right away. I mean, I know you and I have talked over the years about Frank Reich's slow starts in September. Yep. Rookie quarterbacks generally don't start red hot. I mean, our database only goes back 23 seasons, but over that stretch, just 6 of the 22 quarterbacks drafted in the top 5 have led their team to a 500 or better record their rookie season. So, I mean, we're not calling for this to look perfect. I think specific to Bryce Young's ability, right? I mean, he's got great footwork. He throws with elite anticipation, good awareness, which is why, the pressure to sack rate is so low for Bryce Young. Very calm, great accuracy, short to intermediate and between the numbers. But you mentioned the size, right? And the arm strength, and that both those things get tested when the pocket closes in on him, right? That's the one glaring weakness. Carolina's offensive line on paper looks average. We said they'd make a leap last year, and they did. Some of that improvement, a little bit phony, right? If you look at pressure rates, Carolina allowed the second least last season. Awesome, right? But that's mostly because
they threw the ball 6
Carolina
times
faced that, but I mean, it's a rate, so it incorporates that. But they faced the 6th easiest schedule of pass rushing defenses, and then PJ Walker was a decent part of that sample size, and he released the ball in 2.5 seconds on average. Typically, like 2.5 is the quickest you'll see. But when Baker Mayfield and Sam Darnold were under center against that weak schedule of pass rushers, Carolina allowed a pressure rate approaching 33%. So, and then kind of what you're hearing and seeing, right? That's been the weak link so far in camp. Taylor Moton, to me, is one of the better blocking right tackles, but past him, there's some questions. I mean, Bradley Bozeman at center has had 1 of 5 seasons above replacement level as a pass blocker. Austin Corbett, Carolina's projected starting right guard, is on the PUP, solid lineman. Then you have the rookie Chandler Zavala, who has moved into the starting right guard position once his camp injuries healed. Brady Christensen is heading into year 3. He's been replacement level his first 2 years. You have Ike Ekwonu. That's kind of the guy that can take Carolina's offensive line to the next level if he improves. He's shown some flashes. You just need that big year 2 protecting Bryce Young's blind side. But, again, this has kind of been the problem area in camp. Bryce Young also doesn't really have an elite offensive weapon to turn to. I mean, it would have been nice to have DJ Moore.
About Adam Thielen. How dare you?
Yeah, I mean, they've added some veterans, right? You have Thielen, DJ Chark, and Hayden Hurst. Those were the 3 guys that were added in free agency. I think there's, hope that Terrace Marshall figures it out after he gets back from injury, and Jonathan Mingo is an impact rookie. But this is certainly a bottom 5 group of pass catchers on paper. I mean, Thielen was 90th in yards per route run. He was 69th in target separation going against 2s and 3s because Justin Jefferson was the focal point. Hayden Hurst is a decent pass-catching tight end, but that's really all he brings to the table. It's why he's on his 4th team in 6 seasons. DJ Chark hasn't been able to stay healthy. You did see some improvement from Terrace Marshall in year 2. Mingo didn't have the college production you'd like to see from a second-round pick in a wide-open offense, but he's a traits guy, 99th percentile relative athletic score and a big body. I think you would envision Bryce Young having a complimentary ground game. That was the best part of Carolina's offense last season. O-line finished 9th in adjusted line yards created. You spent on Miles Sanders in free agency. He's a little bit dinged up right now, but Frank Reich was basically quoted as calling Miles a 3-down back. Benefited greatly running behind an elite Eagles O-line. I mean, Sanders had the 3rd most yards before contact last season. So I'm interested to see the adjustment, right? Miles Sanders won't be running behind as good of an offensive line, won't have as good of a passing game to threaten defenses and keep those boxes light, and now he's dealing with a little bit of an injury, so it'll be interesting to see how that impacts Miles Sanders. I think the positive is, right, and something you'll hear a lot in this division because they all play each other, is that Carolina projects to play a bottom 5 schedule of passing defenses. And so to me, that's good, at least for an offense making a 180 in scheme and personnel changes. You can only go in one direction in terms of team quarterback play. Right? I mean, the Panthers were 30th or worse collectively in every meaningful quarterback metric, and the defense, should be good enough to allow Carolina to kind of hang around in some of these games.
What's interesting when you look at Carolina, not exactly the softest landing spot for Bryce Young right out of the gates. Their schedule starts out on the road at Atlanta in the division, a quick turnaround against a divisional foe against the Saints, and they go to Seattle. They take on the Vikings, the Lions, and Dolphins before their bye week. But if the light flips on for Bryce Young at that point, a very soft landing spot, relatively speaking, with home games against the Texans and Colts and an away game against the Bears. So it'd be very interesting to see if this is a Carolina team that gets out of the gate slowly, maybe a little bit undervalued, and if you start to see things turn for them, that there'll be some opportunity, especially given what we've grown accustomed to from Frank Reich. Now, defensively for the Carolina Panthers, a change at the top there, a defensive coordinator, a change in scheme as well. And when you begin to look at Carolina, it's a team from its back 7 that there's some level of optimism about a secondary that if they stay healthy can really make a difference, headlined by a player like J.C. Horn, who struggled with injuries, Jeremy Chin, who could benefit immensely from a more aggressive attacking style defensive scheme that they're going to be in. Linebacker, at least on paper, leaves a little bit to be desired. And Payne, other than Brian Burns up front, you just don't see enough of a sustained pass rush from the Carolina Panthers. But when you look at this defense in totality, is there reason for optimism, or are they set to be a beneficiary of a schedule where you're not going to face elite offenses on a week-in, week-out basis, knowing all the question marks that we have about the division?
Yeah, those are some good questions. It's tough to gauge what this defense is because they took a step back last season, and you regress from above average to bottom 10, and certainly there was a couple factors involved there. I mean, schedule difficulty increased year over year, and Carolina faced the 8th toughest schedule of offenses, and then when Carolina's defense stepped up in class, they were torched, and Carolina lost the variance battle on 3rd down, right? Bottom 10 3rd down efficiency. Not a defense with a ton of depth either, and Carolina's defense was on the field longer than any other defense in the NFL because of the offense being so weak. So I still don't think the pieces in depth are elite, But the one thing that's you can kind of pinpoint here is like Carolina has a tendency to play bully ball when they face lesser offenses, and we've seen that repeatedly the past few seasons. And this year, the Panthers defense projects to play a bottom 10 schedule of offenses, right? The most efficient and accomplished quarterbacks on the Panthers schedule are Trevor Lawrence, Tua, Carr, Dak, Cousins, and Goff, right? You don't hear any of the, top 3 or 4 names there. And so I think that bodes well for some improvement. Carolina couldn't stop the pass last season, 27th in pass efficiency, 24th in EPA per pass allowed, dead last in EPA per pass allowed against top 10 offenses. Now, you mentioned the new defensive coordinator, Ejiro Evero, coming over from Denver, was a 1-year DC there. His focus for the prior 5 seasons in LA was secondary. So hopefully you get a little bit of a boost there because he specializes in the area where you were the weakness. And, defensive line, I think, has a chance to be solid. Brian Burns is in a contract year. Carolina's made the offer. It's not the number that Burns wants, so sometimes you get a little bit of an uptick there. But Burns is a good pressure guy. 13% pressure rate on pass rush snaps last season. Finished top 10 in tackles for loss. 40 sacks over 4 seasons. Derek Brown. The light came on finally, right? The 7th pick overall in the 2020 draft, came alive in year 3, graded out 3rd in run defense among 171 interior linemen with at least 100 snaps. Brown also had the best pressure rate on pass rush snaps of his career. Shai Tuttle was the biggest free agency signing for this defense. He's been a plus run defender in New Orleans for 4 straight seasons. Justin Houston was also signed, approaching 35. So can't play a ton of snaps, but a great situational edge rusher. In my mind, 14% pressure rate on pass rush snaps and had 11 sacks last season. But past that 4 up front, there's not a lot of depth, right? I mean, you have Henry Anderson. He's kind of been a plus player, but only played 200 snaps for Carolina last season. You have Marquise Haynes, won't get you completely crushed. And then Gross Matos has been, pretty much a bust to this point. And, we have to think about the Panthers defensive line as a whole, switching from a 4 down front to a 3-4 and the transition time that would take to get acclimated. So, the defensive line definitely comes with some variance. Linebacker room is decent, but lacks some depth. Shaq Thompson and Frankie Louvu are, nice 1-2 punch. Thompson and Louvu graded out 2nd and 3rd as run defenders among 93 qualifying linebackers. Louvu has, I think, pretty much resurrected his career in Carolina. He's just a great box linebacker, was good getting after the quarterback too, 16% pressure rate on pass rush snaps, so they like to send him. Thompson, needs to be better in coverage for a converted safety. Secondary does have a ton of talent, right? And it has potential to improve. If you look, like the unit has 2 first-rounders and 3 second-round picks, so I think you probably get a little bit of a boost with improved health when J.C. Horn's been on the field. I mean, just dominant, allowed, 48 passer rating when targeted his first 2 seasons. Last year, Horn finished 5th in yards allowed per coverage snap among qualifying corners. You still have Dante Jackson, only played 9 games last season, tore his Achilles. He was middling prior to the injury, so it'll be interesting to see how he rebounds. C.J. Henderson is the 3rd corner. Von Bell is a plus safety. Xavier Woods is a serviceable veteran safety. Jeremy Chin needs to find his best role and run with it. That's probably closer to the line of scrimmage, and that's the vibe that I'm hearing, is that he'll kind of be that box safety, maybe the 3rd linebacker. To me, Carolina's defense feels like an average to slightly above average defense that's going to play a below average schedule. So it should be a good unit, especially if you just kind of backtrack and look at some of the priors on how they defend and play against these weaker offenses. It bodes well for an improvement this year.
To your point, it was a group last year that I think we anticipated being significantly better than it performed when it stepped up in class. And so the hallmark of the 2022 campaign was uneven performances. So if you get a little bit more stability, you play a little bit of bully ball, and to your point, they can benefit immensely from taking on teams that won't be able to challenge them on a week in, week out basis. Some of those counting stats that people like to lean on will look significantly better this year than what we saw last season. You can follow Payne on social media at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Fuhrman. You can follow me there as well. Most importantly, though, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. If you haven't already listened to the first 5 NFL divisional preview shows. Encourage you to go back and do so. A lot of great information there to get you ready for the upcoming season and kickoff that'll be here before you know it. And if you're a college football fan, a little bit late to the game, week 0 looms on the horizon this coming Saturday. We previewed all divisions across all of the FBS. Every team touched upon. I think maybe we left out UMass there, so my apologies to the 7 UMass Minutemen football fan out there. But so much great content with Brad Powers in tow as well to get you ready for the college football campaign. And as always, encourage all of you guys to sign up for the Bet the Board newsletter that comes to you every Friday throughout the fall. Payne, this is the team listed as the division favorite. That, of course, would be the New Orleans Saints. And when you look at some of the Saints' big picture numbers here, the Saints find themselves at a shade better than even money to win the division. Their win total has actually ticked up from where it opened at 8.5. Shaded to the over, we're now looking at a 9.5, shaded to the under. Not exactly a ton of value, at least on the surface, when you're talking about a team priced less than 15-1 to win the NFC. And as far as the Super Bowl odds are concerned, they're listed at less than 30-1. The big news that's come out since camp started, Alvin Kamara will miss the first couple of games for an off-field incident as we awaited the NFL to hand out judgment there. This is a group, Payne, that you always have some questions about. Dennis Allen just 15-38 straight up during his NFL coaching career. It's a group with a lot of aging stars, both along their offensive and defensive sides. They made the biggest splash signing maybe of any team this offseason, bringing in Derek Carr on a multi-year deal to give them some stability at the quarterback position, as they apparently weren't thrilled with what they were getting from Andy Dalton and Jameis Winston last year. This was a group, though, that still showed a little bit of passing efficiency. They weren't going to go out there and wow you with some of the big play potential, but there are a couple of nice weapons, headlined by Chris Olave, who did an outstanding job in his rookie campaign from Ohio State. But I guess we can start with Derek Carr. He's been one of the more polarizing quarterbacks in the NFL the last handful of seasons. We saw his numbers regress each of the last few years as a member of the Raiders. And this is a guy that's no stranger to working with a new offensive coordinator. It seems like every other year Carr has to learn a new scheme and a new system. Will he find this a soft landing spot in the Big Easy in 2023?
Really interesting situation, because it feels like early on this summer we understand the pieces of New Orleans. We get their pedigree, some of their priors, and we understand the division in which they play, the conference in which they play, and so we're going out and getting ahead of the market, and guys are grabbing over 8.5 minus 140, and now we've kind of settled, to your point, at 9.5 juiced under, right? We're looking at like 9.3 at this point, so there has been money on the Saints this offseason. I think you could probably cherry pick a metric or two, but the Saints offense was the reason for underachievement last season. I mean, 26th in early down success rate, 22nd in schedule adjusted efficiency, and then, you add Dennis Allen, a defensive-minded head coach, right, making poor in-game decisions that really hindered the Saints offense. If you look, Dennis Allen finished dead last in plus EV go-for-it rate. So, I mean, bottom line, like, life without Sean Payton pulling the strings on offense just wasn't fun for anybody, and I think that's ultimately like the biggest hurdle for me here at the current market price. It's like Dennis Allen retained Pete Carmichael as the Saints OC. Hopefully, Carmichael spent the offseason watching everything Sean Payton brought to New Orleans and tries to mimic it. I mean, like, literally, like, spent 9 seasons with Sean Payton, and it was as if, like, Carmichael didn't learn a single thing, like, didn't take a note. I mean, it was the lowest pre-snap motion rate in the NFL ahead of passing plays. Saints were 30th in play action rate. They used 3 wide receiver sets on first down at the 7th lowest rate, effectively, just telegraphing runs. 26th in pass rate over expectation. So Pete Carmichael has to be better. And that will hopefully, allow Derek Carr to resurrect his career a little bit. It should be an upgrade at the position, but obviously Derek Carr's a pretty polarizing player. I mean, the narrative stuff is all there, right? I mean, Carr's come out and admitted he was embarrassed with how his time with the Raiders finished, and he's got something to prove, and it obviously looks like he's in elite shape if you've watched some of the games and seen him this offseason, right? I mean, he's just said he spent the offseason working on his craft more than any offseason. And I think, the quarterback metrics that have an element of team in them are interesting. If you strip out Carr's rookie season and then his worst season as a pro in a new system, which was last year with Josh McDaniel, Derek Carr's QB 24 out of 48 quarterbacks with at least 1,000 snaps from 2015 to 2021, an EPA plus completion percentage over expectation. I think from a 2023 projection standpoint, last season's output is Carr's floor, and then you look from 2019 to 2021. Carr graded out 6th, 8th, and 12th as a passer. That was Carr's peak 3 seasons. So I think the projection tier for Carr this season is somewhere in that 9 to 16 range. Receiver group to me looks stronger than others believe it is. I mean, Olave, you hit it perfectly. I mean, what a rookie season. He was responsible for nearly 41% of the Saints' air yards, averaged over 2.4 yards per route run. Olave finished 12th in route win rate among qualifying receivers. I mean, he has been the star of camp. And then you have Rashid Shaheed. That was basically an undrafted kid who was given an opportunity and just became a stud. Elite 4.3 speed, 2.6 yards per route run as a rookie. Let's kind of monitor him. He's been a little bit dinged up in camp, so you need him out there, or there are some question marks about this receiver group. You have a rookie in A.T. Perry who's flashed this camp. Surprise faller to me in the draft. There's a lot of people talking about him as like that round 3-4 guy, went in round 6. He's got elite athleticism. If you look at A.T. Perry's score for that, and then his size and his length, depth is solid. If Michael Thomas is a depth piece, you have Traquan Smith still. I mean, Michael Thomas has only played 10 games in 3 seasons. He's not going to be elite Michael Thomas, and at times he's going to continue to struggle to get off the line of scrimmage. We saw that recently in basically his camp battles against the Chargers this past week, where when he gets off the line of scrimmage, he's still really good, but he doesn't always get off the line of scrimmage. And so that'll be something to look for, but I think he's going to be serviceable. Traquan Smith, again, is decent, but you're really hoping the 2 standout rookies in Olave and Shaheed have big second seasons. Jawan Johnson is a nice pass-catching tight end that continues to improve each season. He's having a big camp, so kind of get that Darren Waller vibe from Jawan Johnson. Nice to have Foster Moreau in the tight end room as well. Offensive line is that position you kind of hinted at. There's some guys on there getting a little bit older. I think that unit has a ton of variance. Hopefully it's healthier, right? That's the big, hopefully uptick this season is 25 missed starts from the top 5 guys last year. Overall, the Saints had the 7th most games lost to injury on offense. Trevor Penning is returning from a couple foot injuries. Was good as a rookie when, as a run blocker. Liability as a pass protector, so needs to get that fixed a little bit. Andres Pete hasn't been healthy the past 2 seasons, and he's actually dealt with a quad injury in late July. He's been a below replacement level since 2018. So, I'm not really expecting much from Andres Pete. Cesar Ruiz was a first-round pick in 2020, 3 straight seasons of below replacement level play. Eric McCoy has regressed each of his 4 seasons in the league, so he kind of needs to get back to that rookie form, or I think he might be a cap casualty next offseason. And then Ryan Ramczyk is an elite right tackle, one of the best. So there's a lot of variance there with what is Trevor Penning? Can some of those guys that have good pedigrees step up and be better? Alvin Kamara, you mentioned, is suspended the first 3 games. Word out of camp is he looks really explosive again. So we will see what that looks like. I think he needs to run from a spread offense, right? He can't be asked to be a power back in heavy formations like he was last year. I mean, that was the crime. I felt bad for Kamara last year. He saw 8+ man boxes on 23% of his carries and a 7+ man box on more than 85% of his early down runs, because Pete Carmichael didn't show to be very good last year. And those 2 things led Alvin Kamara to basically being 40th out of 42 qualifying running backs in defense adjusted value over average. And I mean, listen, maybe he's lost a step, but he ain't that bad, okay? So the offense has to be a little bit better there in terms of play calling and play design. Jamal Williams was added in free agency. The counting numbers would fool you, because Williams, to me, is not an efficient runner.
17 touchdowns,
runner.
Payne. You can't shake a stick at that when you get the ball first and goal inside the 2-yard line. It's the only time you're ever leaned on.
That was very nice of you. I thought you were going to say inside the half-yard line, but yes, you are correct.
Well, it took him 3. It took him 3 cracks from inside the 2 to get into the end zone, so he wasn't exactly the model of efficiency.
Good dude, Pokemon collector as well. So I think kind of put a bow tie on the Saints offense. You upgrade a quarterback. Hopefully Carmichael improves in year 2 as a play caller and designer on his own. A couple nice pass catchers, improved health. A couple guys have, resurgence at the same time. Pillow soft schedule. I mean, the Saints project to face one of the 3 easiest schedules of defenses. On paper, right, this should be an above-average offense here.
Above average offense would be a step in the right direction. You mentioned the receiving room, and I think that's a group that's going to be interesting to watch to figure out exactly what they can have with a bona fide number 1 and how the depth pieces will fill in around them. Last year, though, when you looked at New Orleans, I think a lot of people were optimistic about what they were going to get on a week-in, week-out basis from this team defensively. But there's a little bit of a change there in the coaching staff. Both co-defensive coordinators, you talked a little bit about Ryan Nielsen. Chris Richard is gone as well. In steps Joe Woods, although Dennis Allen will continue to call the plays on that side. And when you look at some of the numbers for this defense, they finished 5th in total defense last year. The run defense did slump, though, to 24th. Need to improve on the interior as far as finding difference makers and playmakers to disrupt things. Against the pass, they were 2nd. They allowed less than 185 yards per game and generated 48 sacks, which was firmly inside the top 10. 9th in points allowed, 5th in yards allowed, and 8th in defensive efficiency. On the surface, all of those things suggest that this is a defense that you can hang your hat on and you can rely on week in, week out. But Payne, you begin to dig into some of those figures, and that sack rate clearly not going to be sustainable this year when you have a below-average pressure rate. They had to try and find unique ways to get after the quarterback, and when you can't stop the run consistently, even with a defensive backfield that has some difference makers there, in a Marshawn Lattimore when he's actually healthy, Paulson Adebo if he can return to his form that we saw 2 years ago, this is still an aging stop unit, and maybe this is where I come down on the different side of the ledger. Even with the schedule they face, I'm not as optimistic about how this defense is going to perform with so many key difference makers on the wrong side of 30.
Yeah, I think it's probably a matching vibe for me there. I don't know if I'm as bullish on your take, but I kind of started to see this a little bit last year with my eyes, and then you go and look at it metrically and it says something completely different. And so that's my hesitation. But I mean, you look, the Saints defense was outstanding again last season, 6th in success rate allowed, 8th in drop back EPA allowed, and that was with an injured secondary, right, which you kind of referenced there. 3rd in early down success rate allowed as well. And mind you, the Saints played the 7th toughest schedule of offenses. So when you kind of look at it and zoom out in totality, it was like, wow, I mean, like Dennis Allen was still able to impact his defense while having the added responsibilities of head coach. I don't like bashing head coaches, but I mean, he's probably not a head coach. He's a really good defensive coordinator. And so I think this is probably one of the tougher defenses to project in 23, right? Because it's one of the oldest defenses in the NFL. There's lots of fossils out there. Now, the Saints defense did get younger, right? Spent 2 of its top 40 picks on Brian Brisset and Isaiah Foskey. And I think, well, age is a concern. The other side of the coin is that New Orleans projects to face the 3rd easiest schedule of offenses overall. Fair. Right? A bottom three schedule of passing offenses, a bottom 10 schedule of pass protecting offensive line. So maybe that helps, to your point, like allows guys to get after the quarterback a little bit, more. But like when you look at it as a whole, it's the largest year-over-year dip in schedule strength for a defense in the NFL this season. And so, right, that's the thing that's kind of in my mind why this is very difficult to project. The Saints defensive line on paper, though, just looking at the dudes, it has variance. I mean, Carl Granderson is a presumed starter on the edge. I mean, he had a breakout season in year 4 in the league. It doesn't necessarily look sustainable, right? I mean, he only had an 8% pressure rate on pass rush snaps, but somehow turned it into 8 sacks, and that was part of the defense as a whole not being able to get the quarterbacks, but the sack numbers look good. And then suddenly Granderson became an elite edge setter that could tackle in year 4. I mean, he had a missed tackle rate over 30% for his career. Last year it was 7%. So, like, what Granderson are the Saints getting? Cam Jordan's 34, right? He had a pressure rate on less than 8% of pass rush snaps last year. That end combination is partly why the Saints were dead last in pass rush win rate. And then you have Peyton Turner, the first rounder in 2021, and then the rookie Isaiah Foskey as your other edge rushers. Saints fans are calling Turner a bust. I think he just needs more snaps because he's graded out extremely well over the 315 he's had in the first 2 seasons. I mean, Turner was second best to Davenport last season and pressure on pass rush snaps. I think Peyton Turner needs more playing time. I am hearing that he's in line for a little bit of a boost. He's looked great this camp, so he just needs to get more snaps. The interior of the Saints defensive line is where I have some questions. I mean, Brian Brise was a draft faller, likely would have slipped out of round 1 had the Saints not had a desperate need. He's battling a calf injury in camp. Kalen Saunders was signed for $4.6 million this season, had the benefit of playing next to Chris Jones his entire career in Kansas City and was somehow a below replacement level player for 4 seasons. Nathan Shepard turns 30 in a month, was the big free agent defensive signing for the Saints. He's been a rotational defender his entire 5-year career, below replacement level, 5 seasons as an average. Malcolm Roach is the 4th man in the middle. He's played to a level that's virtually unplayable his first 3 seasons, so I'm a little concerned about what the interior looks like, especially if Brian Brise isn't a day 1 factor. The duo at linebacker is Demario Davis and Pete Werner. I mean, Demario Davis has arguably been the best linebacker in football since 2017, but he's going to be 35 in January. You have to question if the elite play continues. Pete Werner, box safety, was a great run defender and tackler his rookie season, fell off a cliff in year 2. What do you get in year 3? But past Davis and Warner, there's no productive depth. Secondary, you hope, is healthier than last season. I mean, Marshawn Lattimore has some uneven play, but it comes with how they ask him to play, right? They ask him to be aggressive, press man corner. You're going to get burnt in some of those situations, but he is the horse. Only played 7 games last year, allowed 54% of targets to be caught and gave up 0 touchdowns. But again, the consistency needs to be a touch better. Alante Taylor and Paulson Adebo are battling it out for the second starting corner spot. Taylor was better as a rookie than Adebo was in year 2. Adebo didn't make that leap, finished in the 11th percentile among outside corners and adjusted yards allowed per coverage snap, so that'll be a fun battle to watch as the season nears. You have Marcus May and Tyrann Mathieu. That's a solid safety duo. Mathieu played over 1,100 snaps last year. The return home did him well. I mean, he had his best season since 2015. Marcus May, a damn good deep safety. You just can't bet against Dennis Allen having an elite defense. And again, like, the schedule of offenses the Saints play is extremely soft, but there are some holes on this unit. There are depth concerns, and guys are getting up there in age. So, again, this is one of the tougher defenses for me to project this season.
It's such a division that has a high level of variance. I mean, because they all play softer schedules, so you're going to get some potentially inflated numbers, both from an offensive and defensive standpoint. But when you look at the Saints, obviously generating a ton of attention and buzz as far as the betting market is concerned. The win total been on the move. Interestingly enough, though, you haven't seen their odds to win the division change a ton, and I think a lot of that because of what you highlighted, the strength of the Falcons' position early on when things started to go. The final team in this division will find life without Tom Brady to be significantly more difficult than they ever anticipated. And what I found interesting when you read some of the comments and quotes from their general manager, Jason Light, you realize that they were going to have to pay the piper at some point. Quoted as saying, "This was part of our plan going back to 2020 when we signed Tom, that at some point we're going to have to pay our bills, and you'll see that with the largest dead cap allocation over $75 million. So what do you do in that kind of situation? You bring in the very talented and coveted starting quarterback prospect in Baker Mayfield to compete for the job with Kyle Trask. But this Payne, clearly a team that is going to find life to be very different. Shade less than 9-1 to win the division. Their win total 6.5 shaded to the under. To win the NFC and the Super Bowl, long shots in both of those markets. And when we look at the Saints last year, yes, they won the division. Yes, they were able to get to the playoffs, but when they stepped up in class against the Dallas Cowboys, I think that further illustrated the huge chasm between where this team was and where this team needed to go. And a lot of the things that Tom Brady was able to alleviate for them was an offensive line that really couldn't protect him. He got the ball out of his hand as quickly as any quarterback in the league. You look at the historic context in terms of his quick release. not going to have that luxury with either a first-time starting quarterback in Kyle Trask or Baker Mayfield, who has never seen a sack he didn't like to take when he was under duress. As you start to go through this Tampa Bay offense, and we'll obviously get to the defensive side of the ball as well, I'm not sure where there's a silver lining and there's a reason for optimism, but I don't want to be all negative here on a Monday morning and jumpstart a week in a negative fashion.
So let's just kind of start this from the top. Yeah, Dave Canales is the new Tampa offensive coordinator. Been in Seattle since 2010, just doing various offensive duties for the Seahawks, receiver coach, QB coach, passing game coordinator. But Canales recently came out and admitted to not having called plays since JV high school football. So something to think about there. There's a QB competition that has, quote, tightened per most beat writers. Mayfield versus Trask, you kind of hinted at that. But it's interesting to think about it where Dave Canales talks about marrying the run and pass and how his offense will look similar to what the Seahawks ran. And that makes sense, right? I mean, Canales was in Seattle for over a decade. It's all he knows in the NFL. Think about this. Russell Wilson's final 5 seasons in Seattle, 40% of his 170 touchdown passes came outside the pocket. Baker Mayfield is certainly more mobile than Trask with rollouts and boots and misdirections and throwing on the run. The other indicator is Mayfield didn't play against the Jets this weekend along with every other offensive starter for Tampa. And when third stringer John Walford suffered a neck injury, it was Trask that went back into the game. And then afterwards, Todd Bowles was asked about it and he said, I didn't want Mayfield to play behind the backup offensive line. So we're getting indicators here that as well as Trask has played recently, that there probably isn't a QB competition here. We'll see, right? It's another, 2 weeks to get this thing figured out. But all of our current indicators as we record here on the 21st is that it's Baker Mayfield. We've seen Baker have some decent highs in the NFL, but there's clear restrictions to his game, right? I mean, this is probably Mayfield's last shot to be a full-time starter in this league. And if you start to project out, even Baker Mayfield's very best season, in 2020, he had a great offensive line in Cleveland, good run game, damn good offensive mind, and Stefanski calling the shots. And Baker was still fringe top 10 in EPA plus completion percentage over expectation, fringe top 10 in passing grade, was 17th in defensive adjusted value over average, and that was Baker Mayfield's peak. So, I don't believe the current day situation is set up as well as he had it in Cleveland in 2020. I just don't see that on this offense for the Bucs. I mean, the offensive line was not good, right? I mean, it was not good last year. There was dealt with a ton of injuries, but you look this year like it's a mixed bag, and there's a lot of moving parts. Like Tristan Wirfs is fantastic, one of the best pass blocking tackles in the league. Literally just hit the ground running as a rookie. Like he is just a stalwart, right? But he's moving from right to left tackle. So what does that transition look like? Luke Gadecki played 3 positions as a rookie. He's starting at right tackle this season. They claim it's more of his natural position, but a lot of people during that draft process thought Gadecki was a guard, even though he didn't play well there last year. You bring in veteran Matt Filer, who was signed in free agency for only $2.5 million. I mean, that price tag probably tells you a little bit. He's coming off a below replacement level season. He's going to be 31. Filer's going to start at left guard. You have rookie Cody Mauch, right, who's going to start at right guard, but he's making that move, right? FCS to the NFL while also changing positions. And then Ryan Jensen, everywhere you look, is the projected starting center, but he hasn't taken any reps during team drills. So he chose not to have offseason surgery and let things heal naturally. And now Bowles is saying they haven't made a decision on who the starting center is. So if Ryan Jensen is in and out of the lineup this season or can't play at all, like that is a massive loss when you're breaking in new quarterbacks that you don't have your veteran center there, right? The run game is going to change a little bit. It's going to be a mid-zone scheme. Canales brought in a new running back coach. By all accounts, Rachaad White is positioned to be the bell cow back here. And he's talked, you kind of listen to some of these quotes from Dave Canales, and it's basically saying how smooth and versatile White is. And Todd, I know we loved Rachaad at Arizona State. You look at the profile, like 9.8 athletic score. Could be a 3-down back, but the rookie season last year that White had was not good, right? I mean, showed no burst. 6% of carries went for 10-plus yards. That was 41st out of 42 qualifying running backs. White was also 34th in defensive adjusted value over average. That was not the guy I saw run in college. There's also a new receivers coach. The veterans seem to like that so far. I mean, you have Evans and Godwin basically, talking about route stems all starting the same but turning into something different. The reality is, right, the offense isn't going to have Tom Brady, but I think it's going to be far more diverse than basically Byron Leftwich handing it off on first down and then having Tom Brady try and bail the offense out from shotgun on second and long and third and medium plus. Again, I think the barometer here isn't Super Bowl run Tampa Tom Brady. It's 2022 Tampa offense that was 16th in schedule adjusted efficiency. Chris Godwin is another year removed from his ACL injury. Mike Evans is contract hunting and looking for his 10th 1,000th yard season. Russell Gage out for the year, so it looks like Trey Palmer and Devin Tompkins are fighting it out for that wide receiver 3 spot. Palmer's flashed in practices, joint scrimmages, preseason games, had a nice touchdown grab against the Jets. Let's see if Tampa's going to sign a veteran or not. Let's monitor that. The market doesn't like Tampa, right? I mean, and most bettors, aside from a couple trying to play contrarian, don't either. It's why we're down to 6.2 on the Bucs win total. The number, though, is kind of in line with the Buccaneers' prior 5 seasons before Tom Brady, played Captain Savior. There are some positives for Tampa's offense, right? Like you have the mystery and unknown of what Dave Canales will do. Tampa, again, faces a bottom 5 schedule of pass defenses, faces a bottom 5 schedule of pass rushing defensive line. So that's nice to have when you're unsure of what's going on with your starting center and all the movement up front and your quarterback situation. But to me, it doesn't eliminate the fact that Tampa has a first-time OC, first-time NFL play caller, a quarterback playing for his 3rd team in 12 months. And Tampa was actually far worse than their record indicated last season. So, where's your starting point? That's the difficulty, I think, in handicapping this. I mean, Tom Brady was Houdini in the 4th quarter last year, but Tampa was outscored by 45 points on the season. If you look at Tampa's blended 4th quarter win share, it depicts a team that finished with less wins last season than their current market price this season. And I think Todd Bowles is one of the worst decision makers in terms of aggression, and that's why I don't like defensive coordinators being head coaches. Todd Bowles chose to punt more than any coach in the NFL last season in neutral situations when needing 2 yards or less on 4th down. I mean, Bowles is the ultimate governor to offense. And so it makes me a little bit nervous here. I mean, obviously the market is saying this team won't be good, but again, there's some guys that I respect that are trying to angle their way into catching the falling knife, so to speak, on this Tampa price. But I haven't gotten there yet.
If there's some optimism for Tampa, does it start with what this team can do defensively? There's obviously been changes in personnel on that side of the ball, but you get Shaq Barrett back, returns from missing most of last season with a torn Achilles. His productivity remains to be seen. I'm sure Deepak can hit on that when we get to an injury update shortly. Greg Gaines comes over from the Rams, and they obviously use a draft pick to bring in Khalil Clancy from Pittsburgh, dealing with a calf injury, but it's not going to sideline him for an extended period of time. When you look at what Tampa had been in their run to the Super Bowl, they were elite when it came to stopping the run. You were a little bit apprehensive about what you were going to get down to down and the back end in terms of generating a pass rush and what the coverage was going to be. Defensive backfield, look, the starting group, at least on paper, there should be reason for optimism with Carlton Davis and Jamal Dean. They're paying a healthy price tag for both of those players. Antoine Winfield, when he's out there and healthy, can be a difference maker in the safety spot. You do lose Sean Murphy-Bunting, who took a limited amount of snaps over the last couple of seasons. You bring in Ryan Neal to help there. But Tampa defensively, Payne, do you believe in this group as a collective, or are there reasons to be concerned that they're getting a little bit long in the tooth and it's rinse and repeat some of the concerns we had about the New Orleans Saints when you rely on so many guys on the other side of 30 to go out there week to week?
Yeah, I think our thought processes are very much aligned here as well. And you kind of bagged on Todd Bowles a little bit there as we closed out the offense, but I think anyone who's listened to this podcast since we started recording in 2014 knows what I think of Todd Bowles as a defensive mind. I would never hire him in a million years to be my head coach, but he's as good as it gets defensively, and we saw that again last season. I mean, the Buccaneers had the 10th most injured defense, played the 6th toughest schedule of offenses, and somehow finished 9th in early down defense and 10th in success rate allowed. Now, when I look at the Buccaneers and what they're doing defensively this season, right, there's holes. There's not much depth either, but Tampa wasn't throwing in the towel just yet, right? I mean, they re-signed Levante David for $7 million this season. You mentioned giving Carlton Davis $45 million over 3 years, Jamel Dean $52 over 4 years. So they haven't completely packed this thing in yet. I think there's probably wide-ranging opinion about the talent up front. Shaq Barrett was, a one-man wrecking crew for 3 seasons from 19 to 2021, more than a 15% pressure rate on pass rush snaps, 39 sacks over those 3 seasons. It was a plus edge setter as well. But he tore his Achilles last year. He's going to be 31 in November. I mean, I can't envision Barrett fully returning to form. Vita Vea crashed back down to earth. 2 straight seasons of regression, battled injuries last year. Now, if you get Vita Vea to return to the 2019-2020 form, the Bucs are probably cooking. But, I mean, those are just 2 dominant seasons. You have someone who is difficult to try and replicate. I mean, he's like 300 pounds, 350 pounds, Vita Vea, right? I mean, good pressure guy, 11% pressure rate on pass rush snaps from the interior, and was damn good run defender. It's like, can he get back to that form? If he does, he wrecks offenses. I just don't know if he's getting back there, especially if you don't have to focus as much on the edge, right? It's just much easier to double team guys on the interior. Logan Hall was a guy that Tampa drafted in the 2nd round last year. Not good. I mean, among 141 interior linemen that played at least 200 snaps, Logan Hall was 132nd. I mean, it's just an ugly rookie campaign. Kalijah Kancey was taken in the 1st round, dealing with a calf injury, hasn't participated in camp the last 3 weeks. Let's see if he's ready for week 1. Joe Tyron made a nice sophomore leap to replacement level, wasn't a total liability against the run. The 46 pressures were great, but only hit the quarterback 10 times. So kind of have to take that next step and turn pressures into better results. Anthony Nelson can hopefully get back to being a rotational piece. He was better in that role in 2020 and 2021, but then when he was asked to play 600-plus snaps last season because of injuries, Anthony Nelson had the worst season of his career. So I don't know about the defensive line. If you said, hey, Barrett comes back from the Achilles like his old self, and Vita Vea gets back to his old form, and Tyron takes the next step, and Kancey takes the league by storm as a rookie without much training camp, the vibe's different here. But those are all questions to me. Past Levante David at linebacker, the cupboard's bare. I mean, Devin White again played below replacement level for the 4th straight season. His only redeeming quality as a football player is playing downhill and blitzing. 76 linebackers played at least 350 snaps last season. Devin White graded out 70th. Secondary, to me, has 2 dudes, Jamel Dean and Antoine Winfield Jr. Dean is one of the most underrated corners. Allowed just 50% of targets to be caught last season, was a lead against the run, missed 1 tackle all season. Antoine Winfield Jr., right, can do it all. Box safety, deep safety, slot corner. He's best as a safety, but my understanding is that's where Winfield's going to play more this season. They tried him out at slot because they were so beat up back there last year. Did a serviceable job, but he's just much better as a safety. Elite run defender, 2.6% missed tackle rate. Decent cover safety, but that's hopefully getting Antoine Winfield Jr. back to his natural position helps. Carlton Davis got paid. He's above average, but last season was his worst year in coverage since 2018. Carlton Davis finished 73rd in adjusted yards allowed per coverage snap. The other 2 spots are question marks. You have D. Delaney, who's going to start in the nickel, 432 total snaps over 4 seasons, replacement level to this point. You can't find many secondary starters on the open market that go for $1.2 million. Tampa believes they found one in Ryan Neal, right? When undrafted, was on the Eagles practice squad in 2018. The Falcons plucked him off, never played a snap. 2019, the Seahawks signed Neal, never played a snap. Finally plays for the Seahawks in 2020 and 2021, over 800 snaps of below replacement level play. In 2022, Ryan Neal's a liability the first 6 weeks of that season. Suddenly you look at his play chart data. Week 7 rolls around, and Neal finishes the year with 8 fantastic games. Which player is Tampa getting, right? So there's so many questions for Tampa defensively, but you kind of have to trust Bowles. We project the Buccaneers to face a bottom 10 schedule of offenses. Injury luck should improve. Fumble luck should improve. Field goal luck should improve. likely an above-average defense when the dust settles here, barring injuries.
How long a leash does Todd Bowles still have in Tampa, knowing that Tom Brady obviously gave him a lifeline? They got the Super Bowl. But if this team were to struggle immensely on the offensive side, I mean, is Todd Bowles going to be the fall guy, even if the defense restores some level of respectability, knowing that's where his fingerprints are all over in terms of the two units?
Absolutely. And I think what's interesting to me is, like, Dave Canales could be a fantastic offensive coordinator. I actually really like him. The guy's a sweetheart. If you listen to these interviews and kind of hear about his upbringing and what he did prior to football. But you're on the hot seat and you hire a guy who hasn't called plays since JV high school. So there's some variance within that hire as well. I mean, hey, he could be one of the young, great offensive minds, and if that's the case, then Tampa's going to go over, the 6.5 wins, because even with the depth questions, even with the variance on defense, they'll still be good enough that where if the offense is capable, right, they'll shoot through projections. But it's a big if, and it potentially could get ugly. And, Todd Bowles probably is going to be the fall guy here. And then when you kind of just look at some of the situations, right, there's some easy outs. Like Chris Godwin's got a bunch of trade value. You can move on from him. They didn't move Mike Evans. He needs a new contract, but he's at least a movable piece. Yep. And Levante David, he's a great linebacker, getting up there in age. It's only a 1-year deal. You get that off the books. And so you start to potentially build this back out if there's a slow start after you potentially fire Todd Bowles.
So I was going to say, I mean, there are, to your point, a lot of pieces that you could move on from, and if you had to burn it all down to build it back better, Tampa could be one of the primary candidates to try and do so. But we'll keep close tabs on exactly what we'll see from this Buccaneers team on a week-in, week-out basis, knowing how they're currently being perceived and, more importantly, priced in the betting market. We mentioned a lot of the difference makers that may be out there, players returning from injury, and what realistic expectations could be for the upcoming season. Payne and I can only take you so far, but the man that we have waiting in the wings does a better job than both of us. You can follow Dr. Deepak Chona on Twitter at SportMDAnalysis as he provides the injury outlook on the NFC South.
Are you injured or are you hurt?
When injuries occur in the NFL, you need someone to call on.
If you're hurt, you can still play. If you're injured, you can't.
Let's check in with Dr. Deepak Chona, Stanford and Harvard-trained orthopedic sports surgeon and founder of Sports Med Analytics, the industry leader in data-driven injury analysis.
So are you hurt or are you injured?
All right, thanks for the intro, guys. Now, we have a lot of injuries already in the NFC South, so we'll just go ahead and dive in, starting with the Falcons and starting with Cordarrelle Patterson. Now, they're saying soft tissue injury. They're not really giving us much more information than that. So based on his timeline so far, what we can say is that he does have a good chance of playing week 1, but this does sound like it was at least a moderate severity injury. And for that reason, there is going to be an elevated re-injury risk. Again, we don't have the sort of diagnosis to go off of here, but we would think for most of these, you're looking at a 15 to 20% chance of re-injury over the course of the year. And then we have Jeff Okudah. Now, the comments and the way they approached the handling of the situation really suggests a high ankle, and it occurred 2 weeks ago. The return on these moderate severity high ankles is usually a 4 to 6 week type injury, and the fact that he was carted off does suggest that it was at least a moderate severity injury. Now, the key here, though, is that at DB, it's a very quickness and reaction-based position, so the performance hit usually lasts about 8 weeks, and that is expected to go into the regular season about week 3 or 4. And then with Matt Hennessy, not such good luck. He is out for the year with a knee injury. The comments suggest that he dislocated his kneecap, and then he's been having recurrent issues with this after being out previously for the same issue. That's not great news because it does probably mean a surgery, a little bit of a more complex surgery is involved. The success rates of that surgery are pretty good, but the key is we don't have a ton of examples of players who come back after missing this much time and then have this big surgery. And that doesn't make me super optimistic for Matt Hennessy's outlook. And then moving on to the Panthers. Now, Miles Sanders, he does often find his way onto the injury report. And again, he's out for most of this preseason with a groin strain. It's still a possibility that it was a grade 1 strain and that they're managing slowly because they have plenty of time. But the fact that they're saying he's possibly going to be ready for week 1 does suggest that there's a little bit more likelihood that it could be a grade 2 strain. The key with these, either way, you would expect him back week 1 to 3 at the latest. But the key with these is really going to be the re-injury rate. And for an already injury-prone player with soft tissue injuries in his history, I'd probably avoid this player for fantasy football. And then we have Terrace Marshall. Now, he was carted off, and there was a lot of talk about what could this be, but actually it sounds like it was relatively best case scenario. He seems to have a structurally stable back injury based on their comments, and he will likely play week 1. You do see players have a 6 to 8 week hit for their performance for this post-injury, and especially at a position that demands a lot of rotational movements like a receiver making cuts. So for Terrace Marshall, I expect him back at 100% by about week 4, but I would be surprised to see him not touch the field week 1 onwards. And then Austin Corbett, he's on his way back from an ACL. That averages 10 months. He had his injury in December, so he's still not quite there. And then comments on him and the way he was talking about being on crutches post-operatively suggests he also had a meniscus repair as part of this surgery. And the key with that is just that it slows things down just a little bit more. So for Corbett, we're expecting to see him back probably October. Wouldn't be surprised to see him on the PUP list. And again, more towards the end of October would be more likely. And then moving to the Saints now, we have Michael Thomas. Of course, you know he's been on the injury report a lot, missed a ton of time. So we have to go back just a little bit to look at why he's missed so much time. Now, before last year, he had what I would say is probably a moderate severity high ankle sprain. They tried to treat that non-operatively, and then he missed the year with that injury. And then when he came back, it wasn't quite right. It wasn't allowing him to make the cuts that he needed to make. And as a result, he then underwent surgery, which of course caused him to miss that following year. So it was really one injury that missed 2 years. And that is good in the sense that we'd much rather see that than a guy who is re-injured a given body part. So Michael Thomas came back, and from the high ankle, even though it took 2 years, you wouldn't necessarily expect to see his performance drop off a cliff. So he came back. He briefly did show glimpses last year when he was healthy in the first few games that he was a very productive player. And then he had this toe dislocation, a different injury, but in the same sort of anatomic area. And that toe dislocation needed surgical repair, and he has now had that. That injury does cause a bit of a performance hit. Usually for about 1 year, players have lower agility and quickness, and he already really wasn't the type of guy who was going to be burning people. So you look at Michael Thomas as a player who's not likely to get a ton of separation, but he still should have that physical skill set to be a possession-style receiver. So while we don't expect prime Michael Thomas, we do expect a pretty solid contributor there. So Michael Thomas, I think in fantasy football, I would consider him a relative value since you get him somewhere in the wide receiver 40 range. And he does have a very reasonable chance to be a solid contributor this year. And then also on the Saints, Rashid Shaheed out for a few weeks with a groin injury. It's hard to know at this point. It doesn't sound that severe from their comments. And it sounds like they're just using the time that they have to be precautionary with it and take it slow. And that's not really an unsurprising story. We see that a lot this time of year. There is, of course, that re-injury rate, somewhere around 15% for the year on Shaheed. Then we have the Buccaneers. Shaq Barrett, we do love to see, especially after his tragedy, in addition to his Achilles injury, that he is back. They say he looks good. Now, I'm a little skeptical because we do typically see a performance hit for the entire first year back from the Achilles. This, of course, used to be the type of injury where we would see performance hits for even 2 years or more, and many players would never make it back. But this is going to be a tough one for a pass rusher to come back explosively on. So I am expecting to see Shaq Barrett play week 1. I am expecting to see a little bit lower performance than we're used to for most of this year. And then we have Kalijah Kancey, more optimistic here. He has a low-grade calf strain. These don't have a huge injury risk, especially for a young player, and especially with the amount of time he's going to have to rest it before week 1. So very optimistic on the chances that Kalijah Kancey can play at 100% this year and stay healthy for most of it. And then we have Russell Gage. Now, you hate to see these catastrophic injuries in training camp, but he tore his patellar tendon. This is one of the most difficult injuries for a player to come back from. And the reason for that is that to let the repair heal, you have to sort of immobilize the player, keep them off the knee, and that causes a lot of weakness and some potential for stiffness. And then to ask them to be an explosive runner, cutter, jumper right after the season after is going to be a tough ask. So for Russell Gage, next year doesn't really project well. After that, the following season does project reasonably well, but with Russell Gage, I'm going to be fading him for all of next year as well. And then we have the story of Ryan Jensen. Now, this one is a little atypical in that he tore multiple ligaments in his knee, reportedly, ACL, PCL, MCL, and had meniscus tear. But he didn't undergo surgery. And what usually happens in these multi-ligament knee injuries is that you give the player a chance to get some of his range of motion back, because you don't want to go right into surgery and have him be stiff afterwards. So when they probably rested the knee and then tested it out afterwards, it probably felt more stable than they were expecting it to, and therefore they opted to not have surgery. There are a lot of risks with surgery for this type of injury. There are a lot of risks with non-operative treatment as well. It's unfortunately just a huge injury. And it sounds like he's now having some issues of soreness, possibly swelling with that knee. I'm not very optimistic that Ryan Jensen makes it through the season as a meaningful contributor to this team. Again, he does have a chance to play at some point if he can get that swelling and pain under control, but at this point, it sounds like that hasn't been the case, and therefore I'm not optimistic that Ryan Jensen sees the field anytime soon. And that's all I have for now, so I'll kick it back over.
Well, I try and be a glass half full guy, Payne, when we get these injury updates from Deepak. And when it's more guys in the trenches, I guess, than skill position players, I'm sure there are fantasy owners or folks that still have to draft that rejoice going, we don't have to worry about some of these guys. But it is fascinating to hear him talk about Michael Thomas. And a lot of the injury concerns he has were highlighted by what you mentioned, what we've seen in camp already, his inability to necessarily get free release, show some of that explosive big play potential, and obviously why Michael Thomas has looked like a shell of his former self when he's actually been on the field for 10 games over the last 3 seasons compared to that record-setting year back in 2019.
Yeah, I mean, he's 30 years old. So if you're expecting that version of Michael Thomas, you're going to be sadly mistaken. But I think it's key if Shaheed is healthy, you're running Olave and Shaheed out there, 2 speed guys, and then Michael Thomas is the complete opposite of that, so he provides some nice versatility there if he's healthy, but still has trouble getting off the line of scrimmage, still a little bit of a body catcher, so he's going to drop a few. But if you even get 65% of the old Michael Thomas, it's a nice third option. If Juwan takes that next step and kind of mirrors, the Darren Waller role, there's some guys there for the Saints offense. But the O-line is a question mark. Hopefully, the rumors are true about Kamara returning back to his explosive self, and he's going to have a nice little 3-game break. And to me, that's interesting. Like, there weren't a ton of truly big name, impactful injuries, but there were, volume-wise, there were a decent amount here in the NFC South. Some impact guys, to your point, along the line of scrimmages.
For sure. Always want to keep tabs on some of the players that may not be generating a ton of headlines or buzz in the fantasy world, but they'll obviously have an impact on their team's overall output in terms of going over under their win total or flirting with any division prospects. You can follow Payne on Twitter, or X, I guess I should say, at Payne Insider. You can follow me there as well at Todd Fuhrman. Most importantly, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. In Payne, we're getting into the dog days of best betting opportunities. You've rattled off 5 so far through the first 5 divisions. Anything actionable that you've identified for our loyal listenership atop the NFC South?
It's going to make me puke because I just absolutely hate playing overs, and this will be another over here.
That's always a good prelude. It's going to make me puke before I share it, but we know. Yeah,
it's not my vibe, but I think we're ahead of the market on this. We were back in May, and there's still some value here, and you kind of hinted at, even the market's changed over the last 3 or 4 days. But I think we go with the Atlanta Falcons over 8.5 minus 131. That's where it is at Pinnacle. The largest legal jurisdiction in terms of market share also has a price in line with that. And so we went over 8, right? Our benefit's the push. We all still need 9 to cash this. And I just think that offense is going to look a little bit different this year. And I think it could surprise people. So let's go with the Atlanta Falcons over 8.5 minus 131 as the price. Again, full breakdown above. We probably spent 19, 20 minutes talking both sides of the ball and why we like the prospects of the Atlanta Falcons. I would have wished that we could have gave this out over 8. Unfortunately, this day and age, when you bet a game, that's not enough. It requires a 10 to 14 day publicity tour. And so that's why we're here.
Hey, look, you want to go on a book signing, you want to go on a publicity tour, you want a parade. There are a lot of things that take place in the social media era these days when all of these things take place. As I update, you mentioned all the Falcons offense and how we think that group can improve. I'll have to move Drake London and my beloved Kyle Pitts up my draft board, hoping that I can get him at a rock bottom price instead of the tight end, breaking my fantasy heart for the better part of the 2022 season. All right, my friend, we have finished the South. We have the West still to come. I know a division very near and dear to you, at least scheduled on the docket coming up soon. College football on the horizon as well. The football season continues to inch closer, and I know a lot of the recreational bettors and our longtime listeners are itching for a little bit of action as far as the regular season is concerned. I always feel like the offseason doesn't last long enough, but nobody wants to hear that around these parts.
No, it shrinks. It continues to shrink. And your offseason was much shorter because you did that thing for the first time in your life.
It happens to the best of us. That's what we'll go with for that particular storyline. Anything else
I figured that would get you to close this up.
Yeah, I was going to say, you at least know how to push my buttons after 10 years recording these podcasts. Anything else you want to add to this fine show?
No, that's it. I was trying to push you to close this thing.
This thing up then. For Payne Insider, I'm Todd Fuhrman. Best of luck with all of your NFC South preseason investments, and with an Atlanta Falcons win total ticket over the current number, we'll see you at the window.
Thanks for listening to Bet the Board. You can catch Todd and Payne every Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday during football season, breaking down the biggest NFL and college football games. And to make sure you don't miss any free best bets, subscribe to Bet the Board on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.